My name is Darren Holt, and I've worked as a park ranger for over 30 years, mostly stationed in the Pacific Northwest. I've seen my share of strange things, but what happened back in the summer of 1995 still makes me question what I know about the world. It was the year a group of campers vanished near Crater Lake, leaving behind a story that haunts me to this day. It was early August, and the park was teeming with tourists. Crater Lake's crystalline blue waters and jagged cliffs always drew people in, but the backcountry trails? Those were for the adventurers, the ones who wanted solitude. That's where I met them. 4 college kids from Portland, bright-eyed and full of life. They signed in for a 3-day trip along the Rim Trail, planning to camp near the less-traveled Cleetwood Cove. They seemed prepared enough. Sturdy boots, a good map, and decent gear. I remember the leader, Jack, cracking a joke about not needing bear spray because bears don't swim, right? I laughed it off and gave them my usual speech about sticking to the marked trails and checking in at the ranger station when they returned. They never did. 3 days passed, then 4. When the 5th day rolled around with no sign of them, we launched a search. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to underestimate the terrain, but something about this felt different. I couldn't shake the memory of how cheerful they'd been, how alive. The thought of them lost, or worse, gnawed at me. The first thing we found was their campsite. It was eerily pristine, like they'd just stepped away for a moment. Their tents were zipped up, backpacks neatly stacked by the fire pit, and food supplies untouched. But the firewood they'd gathered was scattered in odd patterns around the clearing, like someone had grabbed armfuls and flung them in all directions. Then there were the scratches, deep gouges carved into the bark of surrounding trees, forming symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't claw marks. No bear or cougar could have done that. They were deliberate, almost human, but not quite. The shapes felt wrong, like they didn't belong in the world I knew. The search stretched on for days. We scoured every inch of the surrounding trails and combed through the dense forest, but there was no sign of the kids. No footprints, no clothing, nothing. Just silence. At night, that silence grew heavier, almost oppressive. I camped out with a few other rangers, and we all felt it. The sense that something was watching us. One night I woke to the sound of movement outside my tent. At first I thought it was one of the others, but when I unzipped the flap, I saw nothing but darkness. The trees loomed like giants under the moonlight, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the ground. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, like no animal I'd ever encountered. It seemed to echo from all directions surrounding us. The next morning, we found more of those symbols scratched into the trees near our camp. Whatever was out there, it wasn't shy about letting us know. On the 7th day, we discovered the first body, or what was left of it. It was one of the girls. Her name was Emily, I think. She was at the base of a steep ravine, half buried in loose soil and debris. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, eyes wide, mouth agape. But it wasn't the fall that killed her. There were deep puncture wounds in her torso, too clean and precise to be the work of any predator I'd ever studied. By then, the media had gotten wind of the disappearance, and pressure mounted to call in more resources. But the higher-ups shut us down. They claimed it was an unfortunate accident. A bear attack, they said. Those of us who'd been out there knew better, but we were ordered to stop talking about it. Even now, nearly 30 years later, I can't forget the sounds, the growls in the night, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. And I can't forget those symbols. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them etched into the backs of my eyelids, twisting and writhing like they're alive. The official report said they never found the others, but I know better. Something took them. Something that lives in the shadows of Crater Lake. And every so often when I'm walking the trails, I swear I feel it watching me still. The wind carried a biting chill that night, whispering through the pines like an unspoken warning. My name's Grant Morgan, and I've worked as a park ranger in the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all. Grizzly bears tearing through campsites, lost hikers miraculously found after days in the woods, and even the occasional strange lights in the sky. But nothing could have prepared me for the events of June 18th, 3 summers ago. I was stationed at the Lonely Pines Lookout, a remote outpost accessible only by a narrow, rugged trail. It was an uneventful evening, the kind that makes you lose track of time as the stars come out one by one. Around 11 p.m., I finished logging the day's patrol notes and stepped outside to take in the view. The moon hung high, casting silver light over the dense forest below, a sea of shifting shadows. That's when I heard it, a long, mournful howl echoing across the ridge. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or a coyote. No, this sound was deeper, almost guttural, like something massive straining against the night. It raised every hair on the back of my neck. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, debating whether to call it in. "Lonely Pines Lookout to HQ," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got an unusual sound east of my position, near Razorback Ridge. Could be an animal in distress." HQ crackled back a moment later, the dispatcher's voice calm but slightly amused. "Copy that, Lonely Pines. Keep us posted if it persists." I slipped the radio into my belt, unease settling in my chest. Razorback Ridge was notorious among rangers for its steep cliffs and tricky terrain. It wasn't a place you wanted to investigate alone at night. But protocol dictated I check for injured wildlife or lost hikers. The trail to Razorback Ridge was barely visible in the moonlight, my flashlight beam catching the occasional glint of dew on leaves or the flicker of an insect darting by. The forest was eerily silent, the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. My boots crunched on the gravel path, each step feeling louder than it should. As I neared the ridge, the smell hit me, pungent, like rotting meat left out in the sun. I covered my nose with my sleeve, gagging slightly. The wind carried the stench in waves, growing stronger with each step. My flashlight caught the edge of a downed tree, its bark shredded as if clawed by something with immense strength. Then I saw it. Tracks in the dirt. They were massive, at least twice the size of a bear's paw, with elongated toes ending in sharp points. My pulse quickened as I crouched to examine them, the print edges still fresh. Whatever had made them was close. That's when the howl came again, this time much closer. The sound resonated deep in my chest, freezing me in place. I swung the flashlight beam toward the source, scanning the tree line. Shadows shifted, branches swaying, but nothing appeared. I felt the distinct sensation of being watched, the primal awareness that comes when a predator locks onto its prey. "Grant, get a grip," I muttered to myself, my voice shaky. But even as I tried to dismiss my fear, the rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn back. A sudden rustling to my left made me whip around, my flashlight catching the briefest glimpse of something, pale, sinewy, and fast. It darted between the trees, too quick to fully process. My stomach knotted as I fumbled for my radio. "HQ, this is Lonely Pines. I've got an unknown creature near Razorback Ridge. Tracks are fresh and it's moving fast. I need backup." The reply was static-filled, the dispatcher's words barely audible. "Repeat. Signal weak." "Damn it," I hissed, shoving the radio back into my belt. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming before plunging me into darkness. I slapped it in frustration, but it refused to relight. The night closed in, the shadows thicker than ever. Panic clawed at my throat as I drew my sidearm, the weight of the gun offering little comfort. My eyes strained to adjust to the darkness, every creak of a branch or snap of a twig amplifying my fear. I backed toward the trail, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then it stepped into the clearing. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood upright, at least 8 feet tall, its limbs too long and thin for its frame. Pale skin stretched taut over its body, reflecting the moonlight in a sickly sheen. Its face was the worst part, featureless except for 2 deep-set eyes that glowed faintly yellow. The stench of decay rolled off it in waves, nearly choking me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it tilted its head, the motion unnervingly slow as if studying me. My hands trembled as I aimed the gun, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stay back." The creature let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the ground. Before I could react, it lunged, closing the distance in seconds. I fired blindly, the gunshots echoing into the void. The creature recoiled, a guttural scream piercing the night, but it didn't fall. Adrenaline surged as I turned and ran, branches whipping at my face and arms. The thing was right behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but the ridge's trailhead came into view. If I could just reach the outpost, I might stand a chance. Bursting into the clearing near the lookout, I threw open the door and slammed it shut, bolting it tight. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, the creature's guttural growls echoing outside. It circled the cabin, claws scraping against the wooden walls. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from the supply cabinet, my hands shaking as I loaded it. The growling stopped. Silence enveloped the cabin, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I edged toward the window, peering out into the moonlit clearing. Nothing. The forest was still again, as if the creature had never been there. I didn't sleep that night, keeping the flare gun clutched in my hands until dawn broke. When I finally ventured outside, the tracks were gone, as if erased by unseen hands. Only the shredded tree bark and the faint stench of decay remained. I reported the incident to HQ, but they chalked it up to stress and overwork. No one believed me, and I can't say I blame them. But every so often, when the wind howls through the pines, I think about that night, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. I've been a park ranger for nearly a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. Bear attacks, reckless campers, the works. My name's Travis, and Elk Hollow National Park has been my home for the past 7 years. Tucked away in the mountains, it's a dense expanse of wilderness where even the most seasoned outdoorsmen sometimes lose their way. Most nights are quiet, filled with the usual rustles of nocturnal animals and the occasional late-night hiker. But last October, something happened that I can't explain, and I'm not sure I even want to. It started with a report from a pair of campers. They were young, early 20s maybe, wide-eyed and breathless when they stumbled into the ranger station at dusk. The guy, Jake, did most of the talking while his girlfriend clung to his arm, shaking like a leaf. "We heard something out there," Jake stammered. "It wasn't an animal. It screamed." "Screamed?" I asked, already skeptical. Most screams people report turn out to be mountain lions or foxes, creatures with eerie cries that city folks aren't used to hearing. Jake nodded. "It was close to our campsite. We packed up right after and ran here. Please, you've got to check it out." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, standard procedure for nighttime patrols, and set out toward their site. The couple stayed behind, too shaken to return. The campsite was about 2 miles out, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense pines. The air was colder than usual, sharp and biting, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. No crickets, no owls, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. When I reached the clearing, their tent was still pitched, but the fire had burned out. The scene looked normal at first, but as I approached, I noticed something odd. The ground around the campsite was littered with tracks, large ones, much bigger than a bear's. The prints were deep, with 3 distinct claw marks and a strange elongated shape. They circled the tent and led off into the woods. I knelt down, examining the tracks more closely. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A faint, high-pitched whistle, almost like the wind, but wrong. It seemed to come from deeper in the forest. I scanned the tree line, but the beam of my flashlight didn't catch anything unusual. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I decided to follow the tracks. They led me further away from the trail and into a part of the park I didn't patrol often. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. As I moved deeper, the whistle grew louder, morphing into a low guttural hum that seemed to echo all around me. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a hulking figure moving between the trees. My heart raced as I trained my flashlight on it, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Whatever it was tall, easily 7 feet, with long limbs and a hunched posture. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was wrong. No eyes, just hollow sockets, and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. I froze, gripping my rifle. The creature let out a sound, a piercing scream that echoed through the forest, making my ears ring. It wasn't animalistic or human. It was something in between, raw and primal. My instincts kicked in and I fired a shot. The sound of the rifle cracked through the stillness, but the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it turned its head toward me, its mouth curling into a grotesque grin. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran. Branches whipped at my face and roots threatened to trip me with every step. That thing's scream followed me, growing fainter the closer I got to the trail. When I finally burst into the clearing near the ranger station, my legs gave out, and I collapsed, gasping for breath. Jake and his girlfriend were waiting outside, their faces pale. "Did you see it?" Jake asked. I nodded, unable to speak. They didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any. After they left, I filed a report, omitting the parts that would make me sound crazy, and tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a bear with mange, anything but what I knew I'd seen. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, other campers reported hearing the same screams. A few even described seeing a tall, pale figure watching them from the woods. I wanted to warn them, to close off that section of the park, but my supervisor dismissed it as hysteria. I haven't been back to Elk Hollow since. I transferred to a different park, one closer to the city, where the worst thing I have to deal with is littering. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that scream in my dreams, and I wake up drenched in sweat. Whatever's out there in Elk Hollow, it's still waiting. They always tell you in ranger school that the forest holds secrets you'll never understand. I never took those words seriously, not until I spent my first autumn as a park ranger in Echo Pines National Park. My name is Sam, and for 5 years I've patrolled these trails. The forest has a way of making you feel insignificant, like just another creature passing through its endless, towering trees. But there was one night in late October that made me question everything I thought I knew about this place. It was late, probably just past 11 p.m., and the temperature had dropped sharply, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I was stationed at the East Ridge Cabin, a small outpost perched at the edge of a deep, narrow gorge we called the Hollow. Locals whispered about the place, tales of strange lights and eerie wails drifting up through the trees, but to me, it was just another part of the park. The radio crackled as I brewed my third cup of coffee for the night. Dispatch was quiet, just the usual check-ins and weather updates. I had volunteered for the late shift to clear my head after a messy breakup, hoping the solitude would help. As I sipped my coffee, the static of the radio cut through the silence. "Ranger Sam, this is dispatch. Got a report of an unauthorized fire near the Hollow. Coordinates incoming." I groaned. A late-night trek was the last thing I wanted, but it was my job. I grabbed my pack, flashlight, and rifle. It was standard protocol to carry one out here. The Hollow wasn't a place you wanted to wander into unarmed, especially after dark. The hike down was steep and treacherous, the trail barely visible under the dense canopy. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the glint of frost on the ferns and the gnarled roots that clawed at the path. The forest was unusually quiet. No rustling leaves, no hooting owls, just the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. As I neared the bottom, a faint orange glow flickered through the trees. I killed my flashlight, moving carefully toward the source. Peering from behind a thick oak, I saw it. A small campfire burning in a clearing, surrounded by 3 figures. They were huddled close, their faces obscured by shadows, but something about their posture made my skin crawl. "Evening," I called, stepping into the clearing. "This is a restricted area. I'll need you to pack up and head back to the main trail." The figures didn't respond. The fire crackled, casting their long, distorted shadows against the trees. I stepped closer, one hand resting on the rifle slung over my shoulder. "Did you hear me? You're not allowed to camp here." One of them turned, and my breath caught. His face, or what should have been his face, was a blank, smooth expanse of pale flesh. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty canvas where features should have been. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground. The figures stood in unison, their movements jerky, like marionettes on frayed strings. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. One of them tilted its head, as if studying me, before letting out a sound I'll never forget. A low guttural groan that reverberated through the clearing like a dying animal. Suddenly, the fire blazed brighter, casting an unnatural light that painted the trees in hues of sickly green and yellow. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath me seemed to ripple as though alive. I stumbled backward, grabbing my rifle and firing a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the hollow, but the figures didn't flinch. Instead, they began to advance, their movements growing smoother, more deliberate. Panicking, I turned and bolted up the trail, my boots slipping on the frosty earth. The groaning followed me, growing louder and more distorted, like 100 voices wailing in agony. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at my jacket as I ran. When I finally reached the ridge, I collapsed against the cabin door, gasping for breath. I glanced back, expecting to see them emerging from the shadows, but the forest was silent once more. The fire was gone, and so were they. The next morning, I returned to the hollow with a team. We found no trace of the fire or the figures, just a circle of charred earth and a scattering of bones, too large to belong to any animal native to the park. I've told this story only a handful of times, always met with skepticism or nervous laughter. But I know what I saw. The hollow isn't just a part of the forest. It's something else entirely, something that watches and waits. And every time I hear the wind howling through the trees, I wonder if it's them still out there calling me back. The ravine had always been my favorite part of Yellowstone. My name's Laura McCarthy, and I've been a park ranger here for 7 years. I usually tell people the job is as peaceful as the brochures promise: sunlit trails, chirping birds, and the occasional bear encounter. But the truth is, the backcountry holds secrets that shouldn't be disturbed. It started with a call from a group of campers who'd set up near Blackwater ravine, a secluded area I'd always found unsettling. They reported strange noises at night, low growls and rustling like something big moving just beyond their firelight. Normally, I'd chalk it up to a curious bear or a pair of coyotes hunting, but something in the man's voice unsettled me. "It doesn't sound like anything natural," he insisted. "It's too loud." Protocol dictated I check it out, so I radioed HQ and headed out alone. The sun was dipping below the horizon when I reached the ravine, its steep walls casting long shadows over the campsite. The fire was out, the tents abandoned. A single camping chair sat overturned near the fire pit, as if someone had left in a hurry. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the ravine walls. Only silence replied. I crouched to examine the fire pit. The ash was still warm, suggesting they hadn't been gone long. Nearby, I spotted a trail of boot prints leading toward the edge of the ravine. My flashlight caught something glinting in the dirt, a silver thermos, its side dented as if it had been dropped. I picked it up, noticing deep scratches gouged into the metal. My radio crackled to life. "Laura, this is HQ. What's your status?" "Empty campsite," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Looks like they left in a hurry. I'll follow the trail and report back." "Copy that. Be careful." The trail snaked downward into the ravine, the air growing cooler and damper with each step. The smell of damp earth was soon joined by something else, something metallic, like rust. My stomach turned as I reached the bottom and found the source, a thin stream of water running red under the moonlight. I crouched, running my fingers through it. Blood. I stood quickly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could retreat, I heard it. A wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the rocks. My flashlight beam darted through the trees, catching glimpses of movement just out of reach. I gripped my radio, my fingers slick with sweat. "This is Ranger McCarthy. I'm in the ravine and have signs of blood. Possible injury or..." My voice trailed off as the dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that reverberated in my chest. Possible large predator, requesting backup. Backup is an hour out, HQ replied. Stay put if you can. I wanted to laugh. Stay put? In a ravine with God knows what creeping toward me? I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling as I scanned the underbrush. Then I saw it. At first it looked like a shadow, a hulking, formless mass that moved with unnatural fluidity. But as it stepped into the beam of my flashlight, the details emerged. Its skin was mottled and slick, like it had been flayed and left to rot. Limbs too long for its body hung at odd angles, tipped with clawed fingers that dragged against the ground. And its face, if you could call it that, was a gaping maw of teeth, set beneath empty sockets that stared directly at me. I froze, every muscle locking in place as the creature tilted its head, studying me. It let out a deep, rattling hiss, the sound more vibration than noise. My flashlight flickered, and for a horrifying moment, the darkness swallowed it whole. When the beam returned, the creature was gone. Panic surged as I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly. The dragging sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the rustle of leaves. I broke into a sprint, my boots slipping on the blood-slick rocks as I scrambled back up the trail. The ravine walls felt impossibly steep, the air growing thinner with every step. The growl followed me, growing louder, more guttural. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of it bounding after me, its limbs moving in unnatural jerks, as if it wasn't used to its own body. My chest heaved as I reached the top of the ravine, the campsite coming into view. The fire pit was ablaze, the flames roaring unnaturally high. I didn't stop to question it. Instead, I grabbed a burning branch and turned to face the creature. It skidded to a halt just outside the firelight, its claws digging into the dirt. For the first time, I saw hesitation in its movements, as if the flames were something it couldn't comprehend. I brandished the branch, waving it back and forth. "Stay back!" My voice cracked, but the command seemed to work. The creature let out a low snarl, its hollow eyes fixated on the flames. Then slowly, it began to retreat, its body folding into the shadows until it disappeared entirely. I stood there for what felt like hours, the burning branch in my trembling hands, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Only then did I lower my guard and radio HQ to report what had happened. When backup arrived, there was no sign of the campers or the creature. The blood in the ravine had been washed away by the stream, leaving nothing but damp rocks and the faint smell of rust. My report was met with skepticism, the official explanation chalking it up to a bear attack and my overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, and every time I set foot in Blackwater ravine, I can feel it watching, waiting for the fire to go out. My name's Cole, and I've worked as a ranger in Red Creek National Park for the past 5 years. It's a remote, sprawling park in the Rockies, known for its rugged trails and crystal-clear streams. We don't get much foot traffic compared to the bigger parks, and that's always suited me just fine. But there's one trail I can't bring myself to step foot on anymore: Red Creek Ridge. The name used to remind me of its picturesque views. Now it reminds me of the night I almost didn't make it back. It started with a missing hiker. Dispatch radioed in late one evening that a man named Greg Foster hadn't returned to his car. His wife had called, worried when he didn't answer his phone. I checked the logs and saw he'd signed in to hike Red Creek Ridge earlier that morning. It wasn't unusual for people to underestimate how long it took to finish the trail, but with the sun setting and temperatures dropping, I couldn't take any chances. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, and first aid kit, and set out alone. The ridge trail was tough during the day, let alone in the dark. The climb was steep, and the dense forest swallowed what little light the moon offered. My flashlight barely pierced the thick darkness ahead, but I kept moving, calling out Greg's name every few minutes. "Greg, this is Ranger Cole. If you can hear me, call out." The only answer was the whisper of wind through the trees. After about an hour of climbing, I found his pack. It was sitting neatly against a boulder, almost as if he'd set it down on purpose. My heart sank. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric or claw marks, just the pack and the eerie silence of the forest. That's when I heard it. a faint rustling like something large moving through the underbrush. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but I didn't see anything. The rustling stopped, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Then from further up the trail, I heard a low, guttural growl, something deep and primal that I couldn't place. I radioed in to let dispatch know what I'd found. I've located the missing hiker's pack near the halfway point of Red Creek Ridge. No sign of him yet. Continuing search. I didn't mention the growl. No sense in panicking anyone, especially when I wasn't even sure what I'd heard. I pressed on, the growl still echoing in my ears. The trail narrowed as I ascended, the air growing colder with each step. I tried to focus on the task at hand, scanning the ground for footprints or any sign of Greg. But the forest felt off. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals, owls, crickets, the occasional distant coyote, were absent. Instead, the only noise was the crunch of my boots and the rhythmic thud of my heartbeat. As I rounded a bend, my flashlight caught something in the distance. A figure, standing just off the trail. Relief flooded through me. "Greg," I called, hurrying toward him. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was too tall, too thin, its arms hanging unnaturally low. Its back was to me, and its head was cocked at an odd angle, as if listening. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. Before I could decide what to do, it moved. It didn't walk or run. It darted, faster than anything I'd ever seen, disappearing into the trees with a sound like dry leaves crackling underfoot. My flashlight flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. When the beam steadied again, the figure was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure whether to follow or retreat. My job was to find Greg, but every fiber of my being told me that whatever I'd just seen wasn't something I wanted to meet again. Then, from the direction the figure had fled, I heard it. A high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to pierce straight through me. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. It led me off the trail and into a dense thicket where the trees grew so close together that I had to push through branches to move forward. The wail grew louder, more anguished, until I stumbled into a small clearing. Greg was there, or at least what was left of him. His body was slumped against a tree, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. His clothes were shredded, his skin marked with deep, jagged cuts that didn't look like any animal attack I'd ever seen. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the earth, and above him, perched in the tree like a grotesque parody of a bird, was the thing. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its long, clawed fingers gripped the branch with unnatural strength. It let out another wail, louder this time, and I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. I don't remember how I got back to the station. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my truck, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I must have run, though I don't recall doing so. When I finally caught my breath, I radioed in to report Greg's location, leaving out the details of what I'd seen. The official cause of death was listed as an animal attack, but I know better. I don't hike Red Creek Ridge anymore. In fact, I avoid that entire section of the park. Some nights, though, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that wail drifting down from the mountains. And I wonder how many more hikers it's lured into the dark. It was supposed to be a quiet season. Winters in Blackwood National Park were harsh, and most visitors avoided the trails once the snow began to stick. I'm Clara, a ranger stationed at Blackwood for the past 3 years, and I'd grown to love the eerie calm of the off-season. But one night last January reminded me that the wilderness doesn't rest, even when the people do. I was on night patrol, tasked with monitoring the backcountry campsites. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the bitter cold biting at my face despite my scarf and thermals. I had a checklist of sites to visit, most of which were empty by now. Still, it wasn't unusual to find the occasional thrill-seeker braving the freezing temperatures. At around 9 p.m., I arrived at Pine Hollow, a remote clearing nestled between a cluster of ancient evergreens. The campsite was officially closed for the season, but as I approached, I noticed a faint glow seeping through the trees. Someone had built a fire. I sighed, pulling my radio from my belt to report unauthorized activity. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Clara. I've got a possible camper at Pine Hollow, approaching now to confirm." Static crackled in response, followed by the usual, "Copy that. Proceed with caution." I stepped into the clearing, my flashlight sweeping across the snow-dusted ground. The fire was there, all right, but no one was sitting near it. A single tent stood off to the side, its fabric sagging under the weight of snow. I called out, my breath clouding in the icy air. "Hello? Park Ranger here. Is anyone around?" No response. I moved closer, my boots crunching loudly in the stillness. The fire burned unnaturally steady, its flames high despite the lack of wind. I glanced at the tent and froze. The flap was open, and the inside was empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, nothing. Just an empty shell. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. A faint sound answered, barely audible over the crackling fire. It was a low, rhythmic clicking, like someone snapping their fingers slowly. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, and the beam landed on something that sent a chill down my spine. Eyes. Reflective, amber eyes peering out from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. A bear, maybe? But no, bears didn't stare like that. Bears didn't watch. The clicking grew louder, more deliberate, echoing through the clearing. My pulse quickened as the eyes began to move, smoothly, unnaturally, weaving between the trees without a sound. I reached for the radio clipped to my vest. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Clara. I've got an unknown entity at Pine Hollow, requesting backup." Static. No reply. "Dispatch, do you copy?" My voice cracked, betraying my fear. The clicking stopped. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent. Then came a sound that I can only describe as a guttural hum, low and resonant, vibrating in my chest. The eyes were gone, but I could feel something watching me, something that didn't belong. I backed away, my hand hovering over the holster at my hip. The fire flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the trees. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. That's when I saw it. A figure stepping into the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, its elongated limbs moving with an unsettling fluidity. Its skin, pale and mottled like old birch bark, glistened in the firelight. And its face, if you could call it a face, was a twisted mockery of human features, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a jagged line splitting its head in a grotesque imitation of a mouth. It didn't walk toward me. It glided, its feet never quite touching the ground. The hum became deafening, drowning out the pounding of my heart. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the cold had frozen me to the spot. "Stay back," I shouted, drawing my pistol with trembling hands. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if curious. For a fleeting moment I thought it might retreat. But then it raised one spindly arm and pointed at me, its long, claw-like fingers dripping with something dark and viscous. The smell hit me, a nauseating mix of decay and burnt wood. I fired a shot, the sound ringing out sharply in the stillness. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a sound that I can only describe as laughter, a hollow, echoing noise that made my stomach churn. And then it moved. I turned and bolted, the snow swallowing my frantic footsteps. Branches snagged at my jacket and the cold air burned in my lungs, but I didn't dare stop. The hum followed me, a constant reminder that it was still there, chasing, closing in. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I slammed the door and floored the gas pedal, not stopping until I was miles away. The hum faded, replaced by the roar of the engine and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning. We sent a team to Pine Hollow, but they found nothing. No fire, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They chalked it up to exhaustion and stress, but I know what I saw. I've never gone back to Pine Hollow, and I avoid the night patrols whenever I can. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the station, I hear it, a faint clicking just outside the window. It's a reminder that the forest is alive in ways we'll never fully understand, and that some secrets are better left hidden. If you ever find yourself hiking through the dense forests of Shenandoah National Park, don't stray off the marked trails. My name is Ethan Harper, and I've been a ranger here for almost 9 years. I've dealt with poachers, lost hikers, and even the occasional bear attack. But nothing comes close to the terror I experienced last summer near Sparrow's Hollow. It started as a simple search and rescue operation. A family reported their son, Jason, a college kid in his early 20s, had gone missing after splitting off from their group near a side trail. They'd waited for hours, calling his name, but he never came back. By the time the call reached us, dusk was already settling over the mountains. I grabbed my pack, a flashlight, and a two-way radio before heading out. Sparrow's Hollow was known for its winding trails and dense underbrush, but the weather was clear, and I figured it wouldn't take long to track Jason down. I've done enough rescues to know the most likely scenario. He'd gotten turned around, panicked, and wandered deeper into the woods. But as I reached the trailhead, something felt off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the usual evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs was conspicuously absent. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. "Jason," I called out, my voice echoing through the stillness. "This is Ranger Harper. If you can hear me, stay where you are." No response. I pressed forward, my boots crunching softly on the dirt path. Every so often I'd stop to listen, hoping for the rustle of branches or the sound of a voice. But all I heard was the unsettling quiet. About half a mile in, I spotted something. A backpack lying half buried in the underbrush. It was unzipped, its contents scattered as if someone had rifled through it in a hurry. I crouched to examine it, finding a wallet inside with an ID that matched Jason's description. Nearby, the ground was disturbed, as though someone had been dragged or stumbled off the trail. My flashlight beam swept the area, landing on a faint trail of footprints leading deeper into the woods. I radioed HQ. "This is Harper. I found Jason's backpack near Sparrow's Hollow. Tracks heading northeast. Continuing search." "Copy that," came the reply. "Stay in touch." The footprints led me away from the marked trail, winding through thick undergrowth that seemed to close in tighter with every step. The air grew colder, and an unnatural fog began to creep along the forest floor, swirling around my boots. My flashlight struggled to cut through it, the beam dimming as if the fog was absorbing the light. Then I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping, like branches knocking together in the wind. Except there was no wind. The sound grew louder, coming from somewhere ahead. My stomach churned as I followed the footprints to a small clearing, the fog thickening like a living thing. At the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its bark was blackened and twisted, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. Carved into the trunk were strange symbols, crude and jagged, that seemed to pulse faintly in the beam of my flashlight. The tapping sound was louder now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the tree. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. My beam landed on a figure crouched at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was Jason. Its frame was thin, its clothes torn and dirtied. But as it turned its head toward me, I realized it wasn't human. Its face was pale and featureless, save for a gaping slit where its mouth should have been. The skin was stretched tight over its bones, its limbs too long and thin for its body. It stood slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, and let out a low, guttural click that sent ice through my veins. "Jason," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The thing tilted its head, as if mocking me, and took a step forward. The tapping sound resumed, louder and more erratic, as if the forest itself was alive and warning me to leave. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then it lunged. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding its outstretched claws, and bolted for the trail. The fog seemed to thicken around me, pulling at my legs like invisible hands. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as I crashed through the underbrush. The thing was right behind me, its guttural clicks growing louder with every step. I reached the marked trail and sprinted toward the ranger station, my lungs burning and my legs screaming for relief. The thing didn't follow me onto the trail. Instead, its clicking grew fainter, retreating into the woods like it was tethered to that cursed clearing. When I finally reached the station, I collapsed onto the porch, gasping for air. I radioed HQ, my voice shaky as I recounted what had happened. They sent out a team to search the area, but when they reached the clearing, there was no tree, no fog, only Jason's torn jacket lying in the dirt. The official report lists Jason as missing, presumed dead. But I know the truth. That thing in the woods took him, and it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. I've since avoided Sparrow's Hollow, but some nights, when the wind is just right, I can hear the faint clicking echoing through the trees.